The banquet hall glowed with golden light, chandeliers casting a warm shimmer over tables draped in ivory linens. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the air, a symphony of joy for my granddaughter Emily's wedding. I sat at the family table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching her twirl in her white dress, her smile brighter than the candles flickering around us. At 70, I'd seen my share of weddings, but this one felt different, special, like a rare moment when the world slows down and lets you hold happiness in your hands. I adjusted my tie, a faded blue one my late wife, Margaret, had picked out decades ago. It was out of fashion, but it carried her memory, and that was enough for me. My children Robert, Susan, and Claire sat nearby, their faces lit with pride, though their eyes rarely met mine. They were busy, always busy, with their lives, their kids, their problems. I didn't mind. I'd raised them to be independent, to chase their dreams. But tonight, I hoped we'd share a moment, maybe a dance or a quiet word, something to stitch us closer after years of drifting. The toasts began, glasses raised high. Emily's new husband, Tom, spoke of love and new beginnings, and I felt a pang in my chest. Pride, yes, but also a quiet ache. Margaret should have been here. She'd have loved this, would have squeezed my hand and whispered something witty about the groom's nervous smile. I smiled to myself, imagining her voice, but the ache grew sharper when I noticed the empty chairs around me. Robert was at the bar, Susan was texting, and Claire was nowhere in sight. The family table felt like a ghost town. "Grandpa, you okay?" Emily's voice pulled me back. She stood before me, radiant, her veil catching the light. I nodded, my throat tight. "Just happy for you, kiddo," I said, patting her hand. She hugged me, quick and warm, then was whisked away by friends. I watched her go, my heart full but heavy. Dinner came and went. The band struck up a lively tune, and the dance floor filled. I waited, hoping one of my kids would come over, maybe ask me to join them. I wasn't much for dancing anymore, not with my bad knee, but I'd have tried for them. Hours passed. The cake was cut, the bouquet thrown. I clapped. I smiled, but the emptiness grew. By 10 o'clock, the hall was thinning out, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. My family had left. No goodbye, no wave, no "Dad, let's get you home." Just gone. I sat there, staring at the half-eaten cake on my plate, the laughter around me fading into a dull hum. The young waiter, a kind boy with freckles, noticed me alone. "Sir, you need a ride?" he asked, his voice gentle. I shook my head, pride stinging more than my knee. "I'll manage," I said, though I wasn't sure how. My car was back at Robert's house, 30 miles away. They'd driven me here, promising to take me home after. I pulled out my phone, an old flip model, and dialed Robert. No answer. Susan, Claire, same thing. Messages left, unreturned. The hall emptied. The staff began stacking chairs. I stood, leaning on my cane, and hobbled to the door. The night air was cool, sharp against my skin. A cab idled nearby, and I took it, giving the driver Robert's address. The ride was silent, the city lights blurring past. I felt like a stranger in my own life. When I got to Robert's, the house was dark. My car was there, but no one was home. They'd gone somewhere else, maybe to an after-party, maybe home to their own beds. I didn't know. I didn't matter enough to be told. I drove myself home, the familiar roads feeling foreign in the dark. My house, a small 2-bedroom Margaret and I had paid off decades ago, was quiet. Too quiet. I sank into my armchair, the one she used to read in, and stared at the walls. Photos of my kids, my grandkids, stared back. I'd given them everything, me time, my savings, my heart. When Margaret got sick, I'd sold our stocks to cover her treatments. When Robert's business failed, I'd loaned him money I couldn't afford. Susan's divorce, Claire's rehab, I'd been there. Always. No questions asked. And tonight, they'd left me behind like an afterthought. Sleep didn't come. Instead, anger did. Slow at first, then burning. I wasn't just hurt. I was done. Done being the one who gave while they took. Done being invisible. By dawn, I was at my desk, pulling out old files, bank statements, loan agreements, property deeds. My kids didn't know it, but I'd been quietly managing their financial messes for years. Robert's business loan, in my name. Susan's mortgage, co-signed by me. Claire's credit card debt. I'd paid it off, thinking they'd learn. They hadn't. I called my lawyer, Frank, a friend from the old days. Frank, I said, my voice steady. I need to talk about bankruptcy. He didn't ask why. He knew me well enough to hear the steel in my tone. We met that morning, and I laid it out. I was done carrying my kids' weight. If they could leave me at a wedding, I could leave them to face their own consequences. By noon, we had a plan. By the end of the week, I'd be in bankruptcy court, wiping my slate clean and theirs, too. They'd learn what it meant to stand on their own. The wedding was Saturday. By Monday, I was ready to rewrite my story. Not out of spite, but survival. I'd spent my life building a family, only to be left behind. Now, I'd build something else, a life where I mattered, even if it meant starting over alone. The morning after the wedding, sunlight spilled through my kitchen window, glinting off the chipped mug I'd used for years. I sipped my coffee, bitter and strong, and stared at the stack of papers on the table. Loan agreements, mortgage documents, credit card statements, each one a thread tying me to my children's lives. I'd always seen those ties as love, as duty. Now, they felt like chains. I thought of Robert, my eldest, who'd taken my loan for his failing hardware store without a second thought. He'd promised to pay it back, but the checks never came. Susan, my middle child, had leaned on me to co-sign her house when her marriage fell apart. She'd said it was temporary, but her payments were always late, and I'd covered them to keep her afloat. Claire, the youngest, was a different story. Her addiction had drained her savings, and I'd cleared her debts twice, hoping each time would be the last. They weren't ungrateful. Not exactly. They'd say thanks, Dad, or send a card on Father's Day. But their promises were as empty as the family table last night. I pushed the papers aside and called Frank again. You sure about this, Henry? He asked, his voice gruff but kind. Bankruptcy's a big step. It'll hit your kids hard. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. They hit me first, I said. Frank didn't argue. He set a meeting for Tuesday, giving me a day to think it over. But I didn't need a day. My mind was made up. Monday passed in a blur. I drove to the bank, pulling records of every transaction I'd made for my kids. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. Just tying up loose ends, I told her, forcing a smile. She didn't press, but her concern stayed with me. A small reminder that strangers could care more than family. That evening, I sat in my backyard, the one Margaret and I had tended together. The roses she'd loved were overgrown now, but still blooming, stubborn like her. I thought about the wedding again, replaying every moment, the laughter, the music, the moment I realized I was alone. I wondered if they'd even noticed I was gone. Had Emily asked where I was? Had Robert thought to check on me? The silence of my phone answered those questions. I wasn't a vindictive man. Margaret used to say I was too soft, always giving people the benefit of the doubt. But there was a difference between softness and surrender. I'd given my kids everything, and they'd taken it for granted. Now, I'd take something back, my freedom. Bankruptcy wasn't just about money, it was about cutting the cords I'd let them wrap around me. If they wanted to treat me like I didn't exist, I'd show them what that really felt like. Tuesday morning, I met Frank at his office. A cramped room smelling of coffee and old books. He spread out the paperwork, explaining each step. You file Chapter 7, he said, and your debts get discharged. The loans, the mortgage cosign, the credit card's gone. But Robert's business, Susan's house, Claire's accounts, they'll take a hit. Creditors will come for them. Not you. I nodded, my jaw tight. Good, I said. Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He knew I wasn't bluffing. We spent hours going over details, assets, liabilities, timelines. My house was safe, paid off years ago. My savings were modest, enough to keep me going if I was careful. The kids thought they'd face the fallout. Robert's store might fold. Susan could lose her house. Claire's credit, already shaky, would tank. I didn't relish their pain, but I wasn't their safety net anymore. They'd left me to fend for myself at Emily's wedding. Now, they'd learn to do the same. By Wednesday, the paperwork was ready. Frank filed it with the court, and I felt a weight lift, though it was laced with guilt. I wasn't a saint. Part of me wanted them to feel the sting, to know what abandonment cost. But another part, the bigger part, just wanted to be free. I'd spent decades carrying their burdens. At 70, with my knees creaking and my heart bruised, I deserved to carry only my own. That night, I wrote letters to each of them. Not to explain, not yet just to say I loved them. But things had to change. I didn't mail them. I tucked them into my desk drawer, next to Margaret's old recipe book. Maybe I'd send them later, when the dust settled. Or maybe I wouldn't. For now, I needed to focus on me. Thursday came, and with it, a call from Robert. Dad, what's this about bankruptcy? His voice was sharp, panicked. Word had spread fast. Creditors must have reached out. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. We need to talk, I said, calm but firm. All of us. Tomorrow. He started to argue, but I cut him off. Tomorrow. Robert. My house. Noon. I hung up before he could protest. For the first time in years, I felt in control. The wedding had broken something in me, but it had also built something new. I wasn't just their father, their bank, their fixer. I was Henry, a man with his own life to live. And I was ready to fight for it. Friday morning arrived with a gray sky, the kind that promises rain but holds back, heavy with indecision. I stood in my kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma grounding me as I prepared for the confrontation. My kids were coming. Robert, Susan, Claire. I demanded it, and they'd agreed, though Robert's call last night had been laced with accusation. Dad, how could you do this to us? He'd asked, as if I were the one who'd abandoned them. I didn't answer then. Today, I would. The clock struck noon, and they arrived, one by one. Robert first, his face flushed, tie loosened like he'd come from a bad meeting. Susan followed, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching her purse like a shield. Claire was last, her movements jittery, her gaze avoiding mine. They sat at my dining table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals when they were young, when Margaret's laughter filled the gaps in our conversations. Now, the silence was thick, broken only by the creak of the old chairs. I didn't sit. I stood, leaning on my cane, and looked at each of them. You left me, I said, my voice low but steady. At Emily's wedding. You left me there. No word. No call. No thought. I had to take a cab home. Alone. While you went on with your night. Robert shifted, opening his mouth. But I raised a hand. Let me finish. I told them everything, how it felt to sit at that empty table, watching strangers dance while my own family forgot me. How I'd spent years bailing them out, signing loans, paying debts, thinking it was what a father did. How their silence, their absence, had cut deeper than any knife. I'm 70. I said. I've got years left, but not enough to keep carrying you. So I filed for bankruptcy. Your debts. Your messes 3 years now. Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad. My house, she started. But I shook my head. You'll figure it out. Susan. You're strong. You all are. I raised you to be. Claire stared at the table, her fingers twisting a napkin. Robert's face hardened. You're punishing us, he said, his voice cold. You're taking away everything we've worked for. No, I said, meeting his eyes. I'm giving you a chance to work for it yourselves. I'm done being your crutch. The room went quiet again, the weight of my words settling like dust. I told them about the loans, the cosigns, the credit cards, how I'd tied my financial life to theirs, thinking it would keep us close. Instead, it had made me invisible. You didn't see me at that wedding, I said, but you'll see me now. Claire was the first to break. Dad, I'm sorry, she whispered, tears spilling over. I didn't think, I was caught up in the night. I didn't mean to leave you. Susan nodded, her voice trembling. We didn't know you felt this way. Why didn't you say something? I sighed, my anger softening but not gone. I shouldn't have to beg my own kids to care. Robert stayed silent, his jaw tight. I knew he'd take it hardest. His business was his pride, and losing my backing could sink it. But I couldn't keep saving him at the cost of myself. You're not kids anymore, I said. You're adults. Act like it. We talked for hours, voices rising and falling, tears mixing with anger. They apologized, each in their own way. But apologies couldn't undo the wedding, or the years of taking me for granted. I told them I loved them, always would. But love didn't mean carrying their burdens forever. I'm starting over, I said. You should, too. By the time they left, the air felt different, clearer, but fragile. They promised to call, to visit, to make things right. I wanted to believe them, but I'd heard promises before. As the door closed behind them, I felt a strange mix of relief and loneliness. I'd drawn a line, and it felt right, but it didn't erase the ache of being alone. That evening, I walked to the park near my house, the one where Margaret and I used to sit on Sundays. The bench was still there, weathered like me. I sat, watching kids play, couples stroll, life moving forward. I thought about what I'd done filing for bankruptcy, forcing my kids to face their own consequences. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was survival. I'd given them my best years. Now, I needed to save some for myself. The next day, I started small changes. I called a contractor to fix the leaky roof, something I'd put off to help Susan with her mortgage. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, something Margaret always wanted me to try. I even dusted off my old fishing rod, thinking I might spend a morning by the lake. These were small steps, but they felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd given away. The bankruptcy hearing was set for the following week. Frank called to confirm, his voice lighter now. You're doing the right thing, Henry, he said. Not easy, but right. I hoped he was right. I hoped my kids would see it, too, not as punishment, but as a chance to grow. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward, not just holding on. The week before the bankruptcy hearing passed, like a slow-moving river, steady but heavy with undercurrents. I kept busy, filling my days with small acts of defiance against the life I'd let slip away. I painted my front porch, the wood soaking up the fresh white paint like a promise of renewal. I spent mornings at the community center, my hands clumsy with a paintbrush, but my heart lighter with each stroke. The other retirees in the class welcomed me, their laughter and stories a balm to the loneliness that still crept in at night. My kids called, sporadically at first. Claire was the most consistent, her voice softer now, asking about my day, offering to bring dinner. I let her come once, and we sat in my kitchen, eating takeout and talking about nothing important whether her job, the stray cat she'd adopted. It was a start, fragile but real. Susan sent texts, apologizing again, promising to visit soon. Robert was quieter, his calls brief, his tone clipped. I knew he was angry, maybe even hurt, but I couldn't carry his resentment. Not anymore. The night before the hearing, I sat in my armchair, Margaret's old quilt draped over my knees. I thought about her, how she'd always known when to push and when to let go. Henry, she'd say, you can't fix everyone. Sometimes you've got to let them fall. I hadn't listened then, but I was listening now. The bankruptcy wasn't just about money, it was about letting go, about trusting my kids to find their own way, even if it hurt. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, a clean shirt, my best jacket, the blue tie Margaret loved. The courthouse was cold, all marble and echoes, and I felt small walking in, my cane tapping against the floor. Frank was there, his briefcase stuffed with papers, his face calm but serious. Ready? He asked. I nodded, though my stomach churned. This was the moment I'd sever the financial ties that had bound me to my kids' mistakes. The hearing was quick, almost anticlimactic. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, reviewed the documents, asked a few questions, and granted the discharge. My debts, Robert's loan, Susan's mortgage, Claire's credit cards were gone, shifted back to them. I felt a strange mix of freedom and guilt as I signed the final papers. I wasn't ruining their lives, I told myself. I was giving them a chance to rebuild, just as I was. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. Frank clapped me on the shoulder. You did good, Henry. Now what? I smiled, something I hadn't done much lately. Now, I live, I said. He laughed, and we parted ways. Him to his next client, me to my car. I drove home, the radio off, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. That evening, Emily called. Grandpa, I heard about the bankruptcy, she said, her voice thick with worry. Are you okay? I was surprised she'd heard word traveled fast in our family. It seemed. I told her the truth. I was okay. Better than I'd been in a long time. I'm sorry about the wedding, she said. I didn't know they left you. I should have checked. Her sincerity cut through me, and I reassured her it wasn't her fault. You were busy being a bride, I said. I'm just glad you're happy. We talked for a while, and when we hung up, I felt a warmth I hadn't expected. Maybe not all bridges were burned. The days after the hearing were quiet but purposeful. I kept up with my painting class, even finished a small canvas, a shaky sketch of Margaret's roses. I went fishing one morning, the lake still and cold, and caught nothing but peace. I started sorting through old boxes, finding letters and photos that reminded me of who I'd been before I became everyone's safety net. There was a life waiting for me, one I'd neglected too long. Robert finally came by, unannounced, on a Saturday afternoon. He stood in my doorway, his face tired, his shoulders slumped. "Dad, I'm losing the store," he said. No preamble. I invited him in, poured us both coffee, and listened. He talked about the creditors, the debts, the late nights trying to save what he'd built. "I didn't know how much you were carrying for me," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." It was the first time he'd apologized, and I believed him. I didn't offer to fix it. Instead, I told him about my own struggles, how I'd felt invisible, how the wedding had been the final straw. He listened, really listened, for the first time in years. "I don't know how to do this without you," he admitted. I reached across the table, squeezed his hand. "You'll learn," I said, "and I'm still here, just not your bank." When he left, I felt lighter, like a knot in my chest had loosened. Not everything was fixed, but it was a start. I was learning to love my kids without losing myself. The bankruptcy had been a hard line, but maybe it was also a new beginning. For all of us. The weeks after the bankruptcy, hearing blurred into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. Mornings were for coffee and the newspaper, afternoons for painting or walks in the park, evenings for quiet reflection in my armchair. I was building a life, not just filling time. The guilt still lingered every time I thought of Robert's struggling store or Susan's panicked texts about her mortgage, but I pushed it down. I'd done what I had to, for them as much as for me. Claire started visiting regularly, bringing her new cat, a scruffy tabby she'd named Muffin. We'd sit on the porch, watching Muffin chase bugs, and talk about her recovery. She was trying, really trying, and I saw glimpses of the girl who'd once drawn me pictures and begged for bedtime stories. "I messed up, Dad," she said one evening, her voice soft. "Not just at the wedding, but everything. I took you for granted." I hugged her, my throat tight. "We're here now," I said. "That's what matters." Susan came by less often, but when she did, she was different, less guarded, more open. She told me about her plans to refinance her house, to take on extra work to cover the payments I'd once made. "I'm scared," she admitted, stirring her tea, "but I'm figuring it out." I nodded, proud but careful not to say too much. She needed to find her own strength, not lean on mine. Robert was the hardest. His store closed a week after our talk. The creditors too relentless to outrun. He didn't call for days. And when he did, his voice was flat, defeated. "I don't know what to do, Dad," he said. I invited him over, and we sat in the backyard, the roses blooming brighter now that I'd started tending them again. I told him about my own failures, jobs I'd lost, dreams I'd let go. "You're not done, Robert," I said. "You start over. You fight." He didn't respond, but he stayed until dusk. And when he left, he hugged me, something he hadn't done in years. Emily invited me to dinner at her new apartment, a small place she and Tom were making their own. It was a warm evening. The table set with mismatched plates and candles that flickered like the ones at her wedding. She apologized again for that night, but I waved it off. "You're my granddaughter," I said. "You get a pass." We laughed, and for a moment, it felt like the family I'd always wanted connected. Present. Real. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since Margaret was alive. Not stories, but letters to her, to myself, to the kids I hoped we'd become. I wrote about the wedding, the bankruptcy, the way it felt to stand up for myself. I didn't mail them, just kept them in a box under my bed. A record of this strange, painful, hopeful time. One afternoon, I found an old photo of Margaret and me, taken at Robert's high school graduation. We were smiling, her arm around my waist, my eyes crinkled with pride. I framed it, set it on the mantel next to the kids' pictures. It reminded me that I'd had a life before them, and I could have one after. I wasn't just their father. I was Henry's husband, dreamer, survivor. The community center became my second home. The painting class led to a pottery workshop, then a book club. I made friends Ed, a retired mechanic who loved bad puns. Lila, a widow who baked the best cookies I'd ever tasted. They didn't know my story. Didn't need to. They saw me, not as a father or a fixer, but as a man with stories and a laugh that was starting to come easier. One evening, as I walked home from the park, my phone buzzed. It was a group text from Susan, Claire, and Robert. Dinner at your place next Sunday. We'll bring everything. I stared at the screen, my heart swelling. It wasn't a fix, not a cure for years of distance, but it was a step. I typed back. Sounds good. Don't forget dessert. A minute later, Claire replied with a smiley face and a picture of Muffin, sprawled on her couch. I laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street. The bankruptcy had been a rupture, but maybe it was also a bridge. I'd lost something me role as their safety net, but I'd gained something, too. Myself. And maybe, just maybe, my kids were finding themselves, too. As I unlocked my door, the house didn't feel so empty anymore. It wasn't full. Not yet. But it was enough. For now, it was enough. Sunday arrived with a soft autumn light, the kind that makes everything look golden and forgiving. I woke early, cleaning the house, setting the dining table with Margaret's old china. My kids were coming for dinner, their first real visit together since the bankruptcy, since the wedding that had changed everything. I wasn't nervous. Not exactly. But there was a hum in my chest, a mix of hope and caution. I wanted this to be a new beginning, but I knew better than to expect miracles. They arrived just after noon, arms full of grocery bags and hesitant smiles. Susan carried a lasagna, still warm from the oven. Claire had a salad and that scruffy cat, Muffin, and a carrier insisted he come along. Robert brought wine, a good bottle, and a quiet nod that felt like an olive branch. Emily and Tom showed up, too, with a homemade pie and stories about their new life. The house filled with noise, laughter, clinking dishes, Muffin's indignant meows, and for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. We ate, talked, even argued a little. Robert admitted he'd found a job, not as glamorous as owning his store, but steady. It's a start, he said, and I heard the effort in his voice, the pride he was trying to reclaim. Susan talked about her house, how she'd worked out a payment plan with the bank. It's tight, she said, but I'm managing. Claire, quieter than usual, shared that she'd been sober for 6 months, the longest stretch yet. I reached for her hand, squeezed it, and she smiled. A real smile, not the shaky ones I'd seen too often. After dinner, we moved to the living room, the kids sprawling on the couch, Emily and Tom on the floor with Muffin. I told stories about their childhood, Robert's obsession with model trains, Susan's terrible piano recitals, Claire's knack for finding lost things. They laughed, added their own memories, and for a moment, we were a family again. Not perfect, but trying. Emily pulled out her phone, showed us pictures from the wedding, and I braced myself for the ache. But it didn't come. Not as sharp as before. I'd faced that night, survived it, and come out stronger. As the evening wound down, Robert lingered in the kitchen, helping me wash dishes. Dad, he said, his hands in soapy water. I was mad about the bankruptcy. Really mad. But I get it now. You were drowning, and we didn't see it. I dried a plate, my throat tight. I didn't want to hurt you, I said. Any of you. I just needed to breathe. He nodded, and we finished the dishes in silence, the kind that felt like understanding. They left as the sun set, promising to come back soon. I stood on the porch, watching their cars disappear, Muffin's carrier swinging in Claire's hand. The house was quiet again, but not empty. I felt Margaret there, in the roses, in the china, in the life I was rebuilding. She'd be proud, I thought, not of the bankruptcy, but of the man I was becoming, one who could love his family without losing himself. The next morning, I went to the community center, my painting class waiting. I was working on a new piece, a lake scene with a lone fisherman, his line cast into the dawn. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Ed clapped me on the back. Lila offered me a cookie, and I felt like I belonged, not just to them, but to myself. Weeks turned to months. The kids kept their promise, visiting more, calling often. Robert started a small repair business, using skills he'd forgotten he had. Susan kept her house, her confidence growing with each payment. Claire stayed sober, got a promotion, even started painting, too. Emily and Tom announced they were expecting, and I felt a joy so pure it hurt. We weren't perfect, but we were family, learning to see each other, really see each other, for the first time in years. The bankruptcy had been a storm, tearing down the life I'd known. But storms clear the air, make room for new growth. I'd lost my role as their savior, but I'd gained something better, a family that valued me, a life that was mine. At 70, I was starting over, not with anger or regret, but with hope. And as I sat in my backyard, the roses blooming brighter than ever, I knew I'd made the right choice. I'd left them at bankruptcy court, not to punish, but to free us all. And in that freedom, we'd found our way back to each other.